The sun had barely begun to rise over the vast, heaving expanse of the Philippine Sea on June 19, 1944, when the men of Task Force 58 prepared for a day they knew might decide the future of the Pacific. Some of them smoked in silence. Others tightened the straps of their life vests. Others said nothing at all. They simply stepped into their aircraft, checked the instruments, and waited for the order to launch. They did not yet know that within the next several hours they would take part in the greatest carrier air battle of the Second World War, one that would later earn a name half mocking, half horrifying, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. A battle so one-sided, so devastating to Japan's naval air arm, that historians would later call it the death knell of Japanese carrier aviation. But for the men there that morning, none of that was yet known. They woke to nothing more than a humid breeze, the smell of aviation fuel, the distant thrum of engines, and the sense, shared by nearly every man on those decks, that something enormous was about to happen. By mid-1944, the tide of war had already swung dramatically toward the Allies. The United States had broken the psychological barrier at Midway 2 years earlier. They had seized Guadalcanal, driven the Japanese back across the Solomons, cracked the Central Pacific barrier at Tarawa and Makin, and were now deep into the Marianas campaign. Saipan had been invaded just days earlier, and the Japanese High Command knew all too well what the loss of the Marianas would mean. If the Americans established bases on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, they would be within range to launch strategic bombing raids directly against the Japanese home islands. It would be a fatal wound, one the empire could not recover from. So Japan assembled everything it had left to stop the American advance. The Imperial Navy, once the terror of the Pacific, was now depleted and battered, but desperation forced its hand. The Japanese mobilized 9 carriers, 5 battleships, 11 cruisers, 28 destroyers, and more than 400 carrier-borne aircraft. They called it the Mobile Fleet, though by 1944 it was mobile mostly in name. The Japanese carrier air groups that had once astonished the world with their skill at Pearl Harbor and in the early Pacific battles were now shadows of their former selves. Many of the best pilots had died in earlier engagements. Their replacements were undertrained, inexperienced, and many had never flown from a carrier in real combat. But they were determined. They believed that if Japan were to be saved, it would be saved here, over these waters, against this enemy, on this day. Shortly after dawn, radar operators aboard the USS Iowa and USS Lexington detected the first faint traces of incoming aircraft. The blips appeared like distant insects crawling across the green screens, small, intermittent, but unmistakably there. Voices crackled over the radio networks. Bogies, bearing 280, range 175 miles. It was the first of many calls that morning. The Japanese had launched their first strike wave. On the carriers, flight deck crews moved with practiced precision. The cry went out, "Launch the fighters!" The engines of Grumman F-6F Hellcats roared to life, each one a machine designed specifically to counter the once dominant A-6M0. The Hellcat was faster, tougher, heavily armed, and flown by pilots who had learned every trick of their Japanese adversaries. As the first Hellcats raced down the decks and lifted into the humid air, the battle for the skies over the Marianas truly began. What happened next would later be described by many American pilots as almost surreal. The first Japanese strike group, a mix of bombers and fighters, approached in scattered formations. They were tired, overheated, and in many cases already disoriented. Many pilots struggled to maintain formation. Some were flying aircraft hastily repaired or overburdened with fuel tanks to reach the American fleet. They knew they were flying into what could be their final mission, and yet they pushed on. The first intercept occurred at approximately 50 miles from the American task force. Hellcats dove upon the Japanese formations with brutal efficiency. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, one of the most accomplished American aces of the war, described the engagement as almost too easy. The Japanese aircraft, many flown by rookies, seemed unaware of the intercept until the Hellcats were already firing. McCampbell would later write that the sky was filled with falling airplanes and that it reminded him less of a dogfight and more of a massacre.
Within minutes, the radio frequencies were filled with excited voices. "Splash 1-0! Splash 2! They're going down all over the place!" Pilots reported kills almost faster than fighter direction officers could record them. Some Hellcats returned to their carriers with all ammunition expended, only to be rearmed and launched again. Others stayed airborne, circling the sky, looking for more targets. The Japanese attack had barely begun, and already dozens of their aircraft were gone. Yet the Japanese pressed on. Despite staggering losses, the remnants of the first wave attempted to break through to the carriers. Only a handful reached attack range, and even fewer managed to drop their bombs. Most were shot down before they could release. Those who did release their ordnance generally missed, their attacks disrupted by Hellcats and anti-aircraft fire. The American fleet suffered almost no damage during this first strike. The Japanese lost more than 70 aircraft. As the morning progressed, radar screens lit up again. A second wave was coming, another large formation of Japanese aircraft. American fighter controllers scrambled more Hellcats into the sky. The pilots, already sweating profusely inside their cockpits, gripped the controls and turned toward the incoming threat. The second wave fared no better. The Americans intercepted them at long range, guided by radar vectors. Hellcats tore through the Japanese bombers and fighters. Some pilots stack-attacked from above. Others executed head-on or deflection shots. The Japanese pilots fought bravely, but their inexperience was evident in their maneuvering. Many attempted to dogfight in vertical climbs against the heavier but more powerful Hellcat, a fatal mistake. The sky once again became a graveyard of burning aircraft. More than 90 Japanese planes were shot down in the second wave. By midday, a third wave appeared. By now, the Japanese were desperate. Communications were breaking down. Pilots were becoming disoriented. Some formations became lost over the open sea, never even reaching the Americans. Others turned back due to fuel shortages. But those who pushed on encountered the same wall of American fighters. This time, the battle reached a new level of ferocity. Some Japanese aircraft managed to slip through the fighter screen, diving through gaps in the American combat air patrol. They streaked toward the carriers, intent on striking a critical blow. Anti-aircraft batteries aboard the ships opened fire, filling the sky with exploding shells. Tracers stitched upward. Shell bursts shook the air. Pilots were blinded by smoke and fire. A few Japanese aircraft managed to release their torpedoes or bombs, but nearly all missed. The USS South Dakota sustained a hit, but damage was minimal. For the most part, the fleet remained untouched. The Japanese, however, were being annihilated. Another 80 aircraft were lost. In the late afternoon, a fourth wave approached. These were the last significant reserves of the Japanese carrier air groups, men who knew that their mission might determine whether their fleet lived or died. They flew on, even as some planes malfunctioned, even as others fell behind due to mechanical issues. But again, they met the Hellcats. This final wave, like the others before it, was cut down. Many never even saw the American fleet. They were intercepted far out to sea, engaged at high altitude, and shot down before they could descend to attack formation. By the time the last dogfights ended, the Japanese had lost almost everything. As the sun began to lower in the sky, the Americans took stock. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft had been destroyed. The Japanese carrier force was now crippled, its flight decks nearly empty. The pilots who survived were exhausted, terrified, and in many cases too shaken to attempt further combat. Many had ditched at sea. Others simply disappeared, swallowed by the endless blue of the Pacific. But the Americans were not done. Mitcher ordered a massive counterstrike, sending out more than 200 aircraft to locate and target the Japanese carriers before nightfall. It was a bold and dangerous decision, for night landings on carriers were notoriously deadly, but Mitcher, sensing the chance to finish what the day's fighters had begun, gave the order. The American strike group flew westward across a darkening ocean, searching for the Japanese fleet. Carrier-borne torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters swept over the horizon. They eventually located the retreating Japanese ships. Bombs fell, torpedoes struck, flames erupted across decks. The carrier Hyo was sunk. Several others were damaged. The Japanese retreat turned into a rout. But as the American planes turned back to their carriers, night had fallen. The Pacific was black, moonless, and treacherous. Many pilots ran low on fuel. Some were forced to ditch at sea. Others made dangerous attempts to land on pitching carrier decks. In one of the most dramatic decisions of the battle, Admiral Mitcher ordered the carriers to turn on all their lights, a massive violation of operational doctrine, but the only way to guide his pilots home. Bright lights illuminated the decks of the carriers, transforming them into beacons in the night. Pilots followed the glow, one by one, attempting to land. Some made it, others crashed, but many were saved because of Mitcher's decision. When the night finally ended, the Americans tallied their losses. Many aircraft gone, but most pilots rescued. The Japanese tally, however, was catastrophic. In a single day, they had lost roughly 300 aircraft in combat and more than 100 additional planes due to ditching, malfunction, or crash landings. In total, nearly 600 aircraft were gone. An entire generation of Japanese naval aviation wiped out in one battle. And even more devastating was the loss of trained pilots, men Japan could no longer replace. The next morning, American pilots awoke to the smell of fuel, the distant echo of engines, and the understanding that they had just participated in something unprecedented. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, as the pilots jokingly called it, was not just a victory, it was a turning point. Japan's carrier air power, once feared across the Pacific, had been shattered. In the days that followed, Task Force 58 continued operations, supporting the invasion of Saipan and preparing for further advances into the Marianas. But the carriers of Japan would never again rise to challenge American dominance of the Pacific. Their air wings were gone forever. Their carriers would remain, but powerless, unable to field effective offensive air groups. The battle had marked the end of an era and the beginning of Japan's inevitable decline. The men who fought that day would carry the memories with them for the rest of their lives. Many spoke of the surreal nature of the battle, the ease with which the enemy seemed to fall, the sense of overwhelming dominance, the shock of realizing how far the balance of power had shifted. Others recalled the human cost, the sight of parachutes drifting down, the flash of burning aircraft hitting the water, the knowledge that each one of those falling aircraft carried a man, perhaps no older than themselves, fighting for a cause he believed in. For the Japanese pilots, the battle became known as a tragedy of lost youth. Many were in their late teens or early 20s, hastily trained, pushed into combat with inadequate preparation, and asked to perform tasks that even veteran pilots found challenging. They flew into a storm for which they were utterly unprepared, and they paid the price. For the Americans, the battle was a triumph of technology, doctrine, and training. Radar had given them eyes beyond the horizon. Combat information centers had given them coordination. Their pilots, trained rigorously through a system that valued efficiency and survival, fought with lethal precision. The Hellcat, designed with lessons from earlier battles, proved its dominance. Everything the Americans had built, learned, and refined since the dark days of 1941 had culminated in this moment. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was not just a battle. It was the result of years of strategic planning, industrial might, and relentless adaptation. It was a testament to the power of innovation and the consequences of failing to keep pace. It marked the beginning of the end for the Imperial Japanese Navy and the dawn of American air superiority in the Pacific. When historians later examined the battle, they saw in it not just a tactical victory, but a strategic shift. Japan's loss of experienced pilots had repercussions far beyond the day itself. Without skilled aviators, their ability to defend against American advances collapsed. Their carriers, stripped of their purpose, became targets. Their tactics, once elegant and deadly, became desperate improvisations. The empire's strength had been cut off at the root. And yet, among all the statistics, all the strategies, all the sweeping narratives of victory and defeat, the human stories remained the most powerful. The pilot who shot down 5 enemy planes in minutes, the rookie who fought through fear to protect his wingman, the Japanese aviator who, despite knowing he had little chance, pushed his plane to the limit in a desperate dive, the American sailor who watched the night sky glow with flames as his commander ordered the ships to turn on their lights, the men who ditched into the sea and waited for rescue, the pilots who never returned. These are the threads that make the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot more than just a historical statistic. They make it a story, one of courage, sacrifice, tragedy, and triumph. A story of how a single day can reshape the course of a war. A story of how young men on both sides were thrust into a clash larger than any of them. A story how the Pacific, vast and unforgiving, became the stage for one of the most decisive air battles ever fought. As the years passed, veterans of the battle aged and many passed away, but their memories, recorded in interviews, memoirs, and historical accounts, preserve the essence of that day. The tension before the launch, the roar of the engines, the shock of the first intercept, the disbelief as enemy planes fell in droves, the solemnity of night landings under impossible conditions, the understanding that they had witnessed something extraordinary. Today, when we look back at the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, we see more than just the numbers, though the numbers themselves are staggering. We see a turning point shaped by human lives. We see the culmination of years of training and determination. We see the collapse of one empire's air power and the rise of another's. And perhaps most importantly, we see the reminder that even in wars defined by machines and strategies, it is always people, courageous, terrified, determined people, who ultimately shape history. On June 19, 1944, over the vast waters of the Philippine Sea, hundreds of those people met in the sky. Their machines clashed, their wills clashed, their futures clashed. And when the day ended, the world itself had changed. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot had entered the annals of history not simply as a victory, but as a moment that revealed the full measure of a shift in power. A moment when the fate of the Pacific was sealed not by the push of a nation, but by the courage and skill of the men who fought above the endless blue. That is the story of the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a day when nearly 600 Japanese aircraft fell from the sky, a day when American pilots achieved overwhelming dominance, a day when the Pacific War took a decisive turn, a day remembered, studied, and honored as one of the most dramatic and consequential air battles ever fought.